and welcome to this ICA in Conversation. The British mathematician Clive Humby, way back in 2006, reflected that data is the new oil. Now, since that time, we've seen that the importance of data has only increased. Its prominence, its value. It's the lifeblood of successful business. But do we know how to effectively manage, organize, add value, enhance the data that we have? Well, that's the focus for today's In Conversation, and I'm delighted to be joined by Emmet McParland for a conversation around these critical areas. So in a moment, I'm going to invite Emmet to introduce himself. Before I do, though, can I mention that this, of course, will continue for the next 20 minutes, and we allow a further 10 minutes to respond to any questions that you might have. So please raise whatever questions you have in the LinkedIn comments section. I've got that in front of me, and I'll be reflecting on those, particularly in the last 10 minutes of today's In Conversation. Before we make a start then, Emmet, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. And I wonder if I could start by just inviting you to introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me, Tim. So I'm Emmet McParland. I work as a MI reporting and data quality manager. I spend a lot of my time setting up data quality frameworks, implementing MI systems. So I get to spend a lot of time looking at data, refining data, cleansing data to make sure that it's setting the appropriate picture to the governance for that we report data to.
Well, thank you. We were talking just before we started this in conversation about a suitable lift-off point. And I think that we agreed there are a number of ways we could approach this, but we settled on recognizing the importance of data in the context of governance. I wonder if you could take us from there.
Yeah, and I think it's a reasonable place to start. So if I look at governance of a firm, I'm looking at the governance fora who are supporting the strategic objectives. I then look at the risk appetite and the risk management around delivering the strategic objectives. So if I'm looking at that governance fora, it's then looking at how that is supported by MI reporting. And of course, MI reporting is then underpinned by robust data quality. So what I often find is what a governance fora thinks that they're getting in terms of insights into the risk, into the control environment, etc., can be quite different from actually what they're actually seeing. So what I tend to see is there's, in terms of a problem statement, we have increasing volumes of data that are coming through all the time, and no matter what firm you're working in, and that could be driven by increased processes, new markets, new products, new vendors, things like that. And then, of course, it's an inconsistent application with data standards as well. So with all of that, and no matter what firm you work in, you're going to be increasing the volumes of data that you have coming through. And it's about having some sort of framework then in place to have that as structured as possible, to understand how we identify gaps in data, how we're measuring that, and the ownership around any sort of remediation as well.
So can I challenge that? And I think that's really helpful as a starting point for our discussion. But I think traditionally we've tended to focus on the processes. We've tended to focus on the things that we're doing. And that, of course, drives the data, doesn't it? So why would we focus in particular on the data? Isn't it more important to think about the activities, the processes that drive this? And we can kind of take for granted that the data is going to flow from it appropriately if we can get those right.
Yeah, it's a fair question. I was working with a fintech many years ago and talking to their head of AML and going through this exact process in terms of looking at the reported values through to the authoritative source, the journey of the data. And the response was, like, you're not going to spend very much time here. We don't have any data. So this was a head of AML within a reasonable size bank. So it's about getting people to understand what data actually means within a firm. And of course, the world has moved along a lot since then. And what we also see as well is an increasing regulatory focus on data and data quality that has quite a few examples recently. So, for example, the the FCA's final notice yesterday on Metrobank, and it was looking at the transaction monitoring system and the fact that data was coming from a standalone data warehouse, which was set up in terms of fulfilling its purpose to hold all customer records, etc. But what happened was there was then an issue with the data coming across into the transaction monitoring system. So what that meant was not all of the transactions were appropriately monitored. So the reporting that then comes from that system through the various channels into my MLRO reporting, my EXCO reporting, my board reporting is incomplete data. So in terms of answering your question, we're now starting to understand more and challenge more data and data quality rather than taking it for granted. Because if we look at data as a business asset, for example, and the processes that it feeds into, the reporting that it feeds into, the decisions that are made off the back of the data that we're processing and we're reporting, it can no longer be taken for granted that we have good quality data. So thankfully, there's now a lot of work that's taking place in this field. Still an awful lot more to go, but in terms of what I've been working on in the last 10 years or so in terms of data quality, it's now starting to feel like the regulators are starting to take note of that and really bring this into a lot of their reviews and findings.
And we've seen that, haven't we, in the last two banks that have been quite heavily fined by the regulator here in the UK, and of course we expect this will be replicated elsewhere across the world. So going back, if I may, to your response to the question, isn't it just about the processes, and shouldn't we just focus on getting the processes right and we can assume that the data will flow from that? Well, actually what you've done is provided an example where the processes may well have been right within Metro Bank, but the data was flawed that came out of them.
Exactly.
And sorry,
carry on.
No, I was going to say, along the way, of course, you mentioned data standards as a benchmark, a way in which we're expected to handle the data. That's fairly new to me. What do we mean by data standards?
Well, I suppose the principal one is looking at the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision 239, which is Principles for Effective Risk Data Aggregation and Risk Reporting, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it was rolled out in 2013. Global systemically important banks had to be materially compliant by, I think, 2016. But even, I think one of the last reports I'd read, I think, was 2020, 2021, and it was still looking at that point in terms of so many firms were still so far behind in terms of their compliance with it. Now, whenever we look at a large bank, an international bank, it's a beast onto its own in terms of you may have 10, you may have 50 systems globally doing exactly the same thing. So you have to aggregate all of that data, have one common language and taxonomy across all, and then and that's maybe only for one data point, for example. So it becomes quite difficult and very challenging, depending on the size of the firm that you work on. But looking at the overall standards end, so a lot of this will be based on BCBS 239, and a lot of data management frameworks and data quality frameworks will also be built on BCBS 239 under different guises. So what we're effectively looking at is where data, well, from a BCBS 239 perspective, it's actually looking at the end point. So it's where that data is used in reporting or where it's used within a process and bringing that back to its authoritative source. So if a number leaves a system, and can be a transaction monitoring system, is that data then flowing correctly the whole way through to the end report or into the next process?
So, if I may, I'm going to try and unpick this a little to better understand it. Then those data standards, they're an attempt to regulate the way in which data is handled. And there are a number of variables, and you've touched on a few: language, format, compatibility, presumably, accuracy, a fundamental. But then there's also something about the continuity of data, from source to the decision making, perhaps at board level and so on, because it's going to go through a whole range of different processes, evaluation. It's going to be kept in different formats and so on. And there's something also about consistency along the way. So these data standards, are they attempting to regulate that? Is that a fair description?
I think so. I mean, it's if you read the BCBS 239 paper, it effectively reads as a common sense guide to how you would aggregate and report data. The issue with most firms then is that they are complex and growing in complexity. So it's then about bringing some sort of rigor and structure around that to be able to identify what are our critical data elements, where are they coming from, the control structure that we have, the ownership if something goes wrong, and also insights into the quality of that data as well. And it's interesting, I mean, I deal with a lot of risk managers, compliance managers, and to one of your earlier points in terms of isn't data just there for processing, I have a view on that where it should almost be classified as a separate risk area or compliance area in terms of all of the insights that we have, all of the data that we're processing is taken for granted in terms of this is what we're bringing through. But if anything goes wrong for whatever reason, how do we know about that? Who's doing what about it? What are the timelines to bring it back within appetite, etc.? So it's about giving the consumers of the data enough insight into the quality that's there, the basis on which they're making their decisions, and perhaps you're making decisions in incomplete data, which we see quite a lot. And then it's the how we get from our current state into the target state, and any sort of a remediation that we need around that.
So what you've described, I think, is a process where we can potentially audit the way in which data is being handled. So can we just unpack that a little? If you are invited into a business and asked to undertake an audit of that kind, where would you begin? So what does it look like in practice?
Good question. So it depends. I mean, if I'm looking at the overall MI reporting and data governance within a firm, I'm looking at, so the reports may be linked to your policies and procedures, your risk appetite statement, your business-wide risk assessment, horizon scanning, things like that. So I'm looking overall at the extent and the coverage of the reporting. Does that meet what the board and what the ExCo are signing off on at least an annual basis in terms of this is how we're running the firm? So, and unfortunately what we see quite a lot is you have policies and procedures that are signed off, risk appetite statement is signed off, and it's effectively left there and referenced every now and again rather than being an integral part of how that firm is managed on a monthly or a quarterly basis. So in terms of setting out, it's the content of the report, what's there, and also the structure of that as well. So it's interesting within the ICA PPGDIP, the governance risk and compliance and the financial crime compliance master classes that I host, and it's a great insight in terms of what's actually going on the ground. And unfortunately we still see a lot of reports where it is just 100 pages of text that are just sent through to an ExCo or a board. So it's about really structuring that in terms of what are the key messages that we're bringing through. Is that looking at key risk indicators, lower level metrics, etc.? It's then applying the risk appetite thresholds to that, and then beyond that, we get into what we call data lineage. So it's understanding the journey that data point is taken from the authoritative source through to the reported measure.
There's so much in what you describe. I'm just trying to break it down. If I understand you correctly, there's a number of different components within that example that you gave. So we've got 100 pages of data that are going to the board. One issue is going to be around the accuracy of that data. Mm-hmm. Another is going to be around its alignment to other data, and therefore your ability to properly and effectively use it. But a third, which you touched on, is around the structure of that data. 100 pages of text going to the board isn't a great deal of value. So in that instance, you're looking for it to be structured in such a way that it becomes relevant to decision makers. And presumably there's something about timeliness as well, so that it's at the time they're making the decision. Does that start to be a fair description?
It does, and it's a good summary, Tim. So what the three principles that we effectively look at are completeness, accuracy, and timeliness. And across most firms, those are the three critical we have the others that we'll bring in, but effectively it's looking at completeness, accuracy, and timeliness. In terms of the structure of that, and I know it's not a session to go through MI reporting, but I think it's important to look at the likes of your risk appetite thresholds and things like that as well. I mean, I was in a firm a while back, and we were having challenges in terms of the risk appetite thresholds that were being set around the level of granularity that we were going into. And one stakeholder had said, well, actually, in a previous firm, we had 15 high-level KRIs, and whenever they went red, then we had a deep dive into what the driver was, and we did something about it, and we remediated it. Now, in my mind, that's issue management rather than risk management. So for me, certainly not anything that we'd be taking forward. But you know, in that respect, it's understanding what's feeding into each of those risk measures. And to a certain extent now, certainly a lot of the banks will have this in place at a certain level. It depends how far down they go in terms of their reporting. But certainly things have progressed an awful lot compared to where they were even 5 years ago.
So you mentioned KRIs, and we're talking there about key risk indicators. And a few times you've mentioned risk appetite thresholds. I wonder if you could unpack that. What do we mean by that?
Well, a risk appetite threshold is effectively working within the risk appetite of the firm. And to what I'd said a couple of minutes ago around setting out the content of a report, so I'm looking at the policies and the procedures, the business-wide risk assessment, and importantly, the risk appetite statement as well. So this is what the ExCo and the board have set out around. This is our appetite for doing business with certain jurisdictions, certain customers, dealing with certain products, etc. So it's then breaking that into meaningful measures against which we can then track what is within our risk appetite. So you're sitting in a nice, comfortable green position. You're moving towards amber. What are we going to do about this? And of course, you don't want to then breach your red risk limit. Now, a few things to go into in that in terms of setting those in the first place, and they can be relatively subjective to start with, but as time goes on and you get a better feel for the business, better feel for what's coming through, etc., then it's it then becomes much more robust. But it's linking it to the wider statements that we have and what's approved by the board, the ExCo, etc., into something that we can monitor on a monthly or a quarterly basis, depending on how the particular firm manages risk. But for me, it's the bringing it to life. And if I look at the dashboard in my car, for example, so I started driving 20 years ago. My dashboard today isn't overly different from my dashboard 20 years ago. It still has pretty much the key information. It's digitized, but apart from that, it's pretty standard. So it's what's the key information that I need to get a feel for what's actually going on within the business. Because again, if we look at the board and they delegate responsibility to the ExCo, delegate responsibility to heads of it, and so on, it's about collating all of that information and bringing it to a level that's appropriate for every audience. So
by risk appetite statement, we're talking about the board making a conscious decision about what is acceptable within that business. And a good example might be acceptable products, jurisdictions, dealing with profile of customers. And this is a way of anticipating the level of risk that you as an organisation are willing to carry. And that, of course, is a board level decision. The role of MI, the role of data in this is, if I understand you correctly, it's about bringing it to life. Otherwise, the board might make a decision, but it would have no way of knowing whether or not that decision is turned into practice. Is that a fair summary?
It is, effectively. And even things like the data lineage will take you to a certain level. So if I have a reported number, and again in Metrobank's case, it may be reasonable to take that back to their automated transaction monitoring system to say the system has given me this number of hits, this number of false positives. We report that into the respective committees. But things like incomplete data sets being fed into the transaction monitoring system would not routinely be called out. So therefore we've got separate measures in terms of annual attestations, for example, where we would bring in an external firm who specialise in this to run their dummy or their test data through it. Are we getting all of the information that we need, all of the hits, etc., that are coming through? So the MI aspect of it has many different layers in terms of what we're looking at. But unfortunately, it's one of these things that and especially for a lot of fintechs that are coming through and a lot of challenger banks, is the MI isn't always the key aspect. It's about growing the organization. It's the new markets. It's the new products. What can we do? And if we have time, I might go into bringing in new systems as well and the challenges that we have with MI in that aspect. But unfortunately, MI is generally considered an afterthought. So it's a case of, well, what can it give us? Let's just report that through rather than taking it from the top-down audience-focused approach into MI and data, because it's one of those things, and we hear it very often, we have data-driven decisions, data-driven reporting, but of course it has to be from the top-down audience focus, that you've got the filtering almost of the millions or billions of data points that you have within a firm.
Top-down audience focus. This is about taking what might be 100 pages of text and structuring it in such a way that it retains its accuracy but becomes digestible in the few moments, realistically, in a board meeting when it might be considered at the time of a decision being made.
It's exactly that. And you think about the number of papers that are going through boards and excos. I mean, it is, I've seen it, it's literally a page turn in terms of what am I calling out, what are the key things. So things like your risk appetite, KRIs, it's doing that job for you. And it works effectively.
And if it's not working, of course, what it leads to is flawed decision making.
Unfortunately, data is one of those things that no one is really interested in it until all of a sudden everyone is interested because you've had an external opinion on it. And then all of a sudden we ask the questions around, well, how did we get this so wrong? Why were those data feeds not checked, et cetera, et cetera. But what I often, and something that I was just going to go into, where we have the implementation of systems. And unfortunately, system implementation is a challenging for a number of reasons. But generally, what we have is a business that are setting out business requirements that are generally pressed for time. They're doing this on the side of the desk to their normal day jobs. You have system delivery teams that are again under pressure. They're getting change requests as they go along. You have UAT that again based on maybe incomplete, inaccurate business requirements.
UAT.
Sorry, user acceptance testing. Good. I'm glad we clarified. So it's all of that. So, and if you take all of that together and then that's what you then have in operation within your organization. So you have something that has a pretty shaky foundation at the best of times, that you're now relying on for possibly the next 5 years or maybe whatever, in terms of bringing that data through to your senior management to make the management decisions to support the strategic objectives of the firm, and that's what we're working with. It's it can be challenging for a lot of reasons.
I've got one or two more questions I'd like to ask, but as we move on, can I just remind those that are joining us from around the world, if you have any questions or any thoughts, please post them within the LinkedIn post, and we'll bring them to Emmet's attention as we go along. But meantime, I mentioned the hippo in one of the posts concerning this inCONVERSATION, and I think you were saying, well, what are you talking about, Tim? And so if you were having that view, then it's likely that many others would wonder, what is a hippo, and how does it add value to this conversation around data? Well, of course, a hippo is a highly paid person's opinion. A hippo. I understand it's sort of common parlance in business circles, a highly paid person's opinion. And I think it acts as a foil, as a counterpoint to what we're talking about here, which is data-driven insights informing good decision-making. We may be moving from a position over the last few decades where key decisions were very often, perhaps not always, but very often made in the context of a hippo, because that's, of course, why we pay people so much, because they are infallible and never get it wrong. But now, of course, we're using data in a slightly more structured way. So, can you reflect on that? I mean, what are you seeing in this space?
It's an interesting perspective, and I mean, clearly it shows the evolution of risk management as well, and accountability within firms. So, if I take that away from your hippo, then, for example, into an effective committee meeting or a other governance fora. It's something that we see quite a lot. The regulator will review the minutes and the actions of committees, etc. And what they're looking for is what is coming through in terms of the management information. How has that been challenged? And the decisions that are made off the back of it, and the follow-on actions. But we're thankfully, to a certain extent, moving away from the hippo steering the course. But of course, that does depend on the firm. So the larger banks, for example, may suffer from this a little bit less than your average fintech, for example, where you still have an owner in place and is driving a lot of the decisions, etc. So then it becomes being able to challenge decisions based on data becomes it becomes a way in terms of being able to challenge that in terms of, well, actually, is this the right decision to take? Is this where we want to go? And the impacts of that. So it's something that we see quite a lot. It's also interesting within risk appetite in general, and a lot of firms will say, well, look, we're operating within green, it's okay, life is good, but it's understanding then the quality of the data behind that green, and if that's all red because we're missing out half of the world or half our products aren't covered, whatever, then that sea of green can very quickly turn into a sea of red because we've completely breached any sort of appetite thresholds that we have.
That makes good sense. We've got just a few minutes remaining, and I'm keen, if I may, to use that time to think about this on a slightly different level. So far we've been talking about data largely, I think, in the context of fairly large, sophisticated organizations that have maybe fairly large compliance capabilities, reporting, and a sort of infrastructure around all of this. Can we finish by just thinking about smaller organizations that perhaps don't have or recognize some of the things that we've been talking about and in the way that we've been talking about it? How can we, within medium-sized business, small to medium-sized business, how can we ensure we make best use of the data that we have? How do we ensure that its accuracy, that we are using it effectively to inform our decision making? Is there anything more basic that you can share around this?
For me, a ownership and accountability is key, and that's at all levels. So from the very start, and if it's a large firm or a small firm, it's effectively the data inputter that is going to steer the ship in terms of the quality of the data that we have in a lot of systems. So, for example, I remember applying for my first mortgage many years ago and asked for my date of birth and given the date of birth, say, well, I'll just put in 0101, and there we go. But of course, that then transfers through into a bank system and everything that goes with it. So those practices are starting to fade out, but there's still an awful lot of it. And what we see is the quality of the data that's input at the very start has such an impact then in terms of your even things like your sanction screening, etc. For to bring that to life a little bit in terms of the ownership. But from smaller firms, it still has to be the ownership perspective in terms of I'm still dealing with this data set. What are the downstream impacts of getting this wrong? So we often talk about the upstream. So where's data coming from? What's the journey to get to my position? But as importantly, it's also the downstream impact as well. So whenever I finish processing this data, where's it going to, for what reason? And something that I see quite a lot is data is produced for a specific purpose, but someone then lifts that data set and says, well, actually, that's useful. I think I could use that, manipulate that, and end up using it for an entirely different purpose beyond what it was initially intended for. And then instantly you get the misreporting risks off the back of that, because the original producer of that data has never intended for it to be used for this other use. And we get scenarios.
Do you know, I
like
imagine that there are a number of people who are watching this now will be cringing when you say that. I know I've done that. It's very easy to do. You look at a set of data and you think, well, this is really useful, and actually maybe it supports the argument I'm making or the decision that I want to make, and you just drop it into a completely different context. Your point here is, well, you need to go back to the reason that data is being captured, what questions it's answering, and have an understanding of that before you could consider using it in a different context. Yeah, that's a good point, and it candidly, it's not something I've thought about too much before, so this is really useful. We are coming up towards the end of our 30 minutes. So if I may, I'm just going to summarize, I think, some of the strands of conversation that we've had. And we've talked about data in the context of governance, recognizing its importance to underpin our understanding of risk, to underpin the decision making that we're doing and we're undertaking within any organization. But we've also looked at it in terms of business-wide risk assessment, our risk appetite, our policies and procedures, our reporting arrangements. We've looked at it in terms of completeness, accuracy, and timeliness. We've recognized the importance of having effective ownership and accountability around the data that's flowing across our businesses and across our systems. And along the way, I think we've recognized the importance of ensuring that there is effective control around the way, and I'm paraphrasing now, but effective control around our data. So, for instance, we're not repurposing or reusing it in a way that wasn't originally intended, or if we are, we're taking it back to source and we're making sure it's the same questions that are being answered. Thank you. In a moment, Emmet, we're going to continue this conversation. I think we're going to spend a little bit longer thinking about those case studies, the Metro Bank and the Starling Bank case studies, to understand what went wrong in those. That's going to be recorded and will be available on the Learning Hub for any ICA members if you'd like to hear more about these really important subjects. But for the moment, can I thank you again for your time in joining us today? And thank you, wherever you are around the world, for joining us as well. And we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.